The struggle between freedom and tyranny is not confined to any one nation or region. It is a global theme that, sadly, is becoming increasingly relevant in our time. Around the world, we are witnessing signs of a rising authoritarianism, along with a concerning suppression of human rights and civil liberties. Yet, we also see the courage of those who choose to resist it. The ongoing fight for democracy and dignity in Myanmar stands as a stark example of this global struggle, illuminating a shared human yearning for freedom, justice, and self-determination. In this way, their fight is everyone's fight. And so with that in mind, let's get into today's show.
And welcome back. Today we are once again straying a little bit further from our regular area of focus. We will not even be particularly focused on Myanmar today. Rather, what we want to focus on is Sudan and more broadly the Central and East African space. And my guest today is an expert in the field. This is going to be an interesting interview, I think, because I am not particularly well versed in Africa, and my guest today, Lara, is not particularly well versed in Myanmar. But we hope to see a lot of similarities between the two domains and in their histories and their developments, and very likely in the colonial impact that is still being felt to this day. But before we get into any of that, Lara, thank you very much for giving us your time and your expertise. And I'd like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself for our audience.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. My name is Lahra Smith. I'm an associate professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I am a professor of political science, and I specialize in East African politics, although I teach African politics broadly, as is the way academia is organized. I've mostly written on Ethiopia and Kenya, and also have a new book that I hope to come out this year that's on migration of Ethiopians through Djibouti. So a lot of field work in Djibouti as well, but work more broadly in East Africa as well.
So pretty incredible. And like right before we even get into it, just the note you make that you clearly have an area of specialization,
Mm-hmm.
and you are being asked by the academic institution to teach African politics, which I think I think anyone who has familiarity with post-colonial spaces probably gets very preemptively agitated when entire regions get lumped into one thing, because as we understand, that makes no sense. That's not how continents work. They're not unitary. So right off the bat, do you feel that within even academia, not just in common discussion, not just in mass media, but in academia, there is a lack of nuance and a lack of understanding of just how diverse, just how complex, just how significant the individual political systems, cultural systems, identities of Africa, or when we're speaking, obviously we're looking at it in the Southeast Asian context, and a lack of awareness of the diversity there. But do you feel that there is, even within academia, a lack of respect and a lack of awareness for just how complex and just how diverse a lot of these regions are?
Absolutely. I think higher education is slow to keep pace actually with the people that embody it, in terms of the research that's being done. So I mean, I'll come back in a second to this. My colleagues and I, across, sort of several intellectual generations, so to speak, have really vibrant conversations about this. So I think we're on the same page across different regions. The Asian studies folks, the Latin Americanists and Central Americanists and Africanists and so on, are having really the Middle Easternists, right? We're having really vibrant conversations about sort of where the edges do or don't exist, where the borders are, so to speak, in air quotes. But the higher education institutions remain very much locked in these colonial
Mm,
boundaries. So I think the best example of that for me, as someone who studies African politics, is, as you suggest, like the fact that I am hired to teach all of Africa, which I am, but actually all of Africa is actually sub-Saharan Africa, although I don't say sub-Saharan Africa. So Africa actually means Africa south of the Sahara, and North Africa is still that, sort of lumped with that colonial entity of the Middle East, MENA, Middle East and North Africa.
mm,
The legacy directly of colonialism. And it's one that luckily we at Georgetown, collaboratively and intentionally with my colleagues in our Middle East program, which is called the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, but is the Middle East Studies program. We intentionally are constantly trying to disrupt in both our classes, in our programming and events, in direct conversations we have about it. But the reality is that when the university hires new faculty and when they structure courses, they are continually trying to sort of reorient us back to that. And when we do hirings and when we do courses amongst ourselves, we try to disrupt that. And Sudan, what we're talking about today, is actually the place that is the most uh, obvious space for that, right? Because
mm,
does Sudan, sort of go in North Africa, or does it go in Africa, what I call Africa,
mm,
what called sub-Saharan Africa? And so our position as the two centers within the School of Foreign Service, which is a very, more than 100-year-old programming, space with regional study centers for all of the world, we never do a Sudan program that is not collaborative between our two programs. And
mm.
we've had for a year and a half a set of programming events called Keep Eyes on Sudan that have been jointly programmed by both of our center and program.
I'm glad to hear it because I was just thinking about anyone who is in the Myanmar space, academically is in the Myanmar space, would be familiar with SOAS,
Mm. Yep.
which they've moved away from using the full name. They just refer to it. I think they refer to it as University of London SOAS now, but the School of Oriental and African Studies. The idea that even that just Africa and the Orient can be lumped together into a single academic institution. um, it really does sort of keep that colonial mindset alive. And this is not to disparage SOAS at all. I think SOAS has done some phenomenal research and produced some outstanding academics. I'm not trying to disparage the quality of their work, but it shows that legacy. It shows that academia continues to be practiced within institutions that were founded at a time when a specific mindset and a specific perspective of the world was considered to be standard and unchallenged.
Mhm.
And it's very interesting that Sudan is treated in that way, because when I was younger, I was very passionate about ancient Egypt. I have a penchant for ancient history,
Mhm.
and Sudan, Ethiopia, places like that came up when you study ancient Egypt. These are things where you feel there is clearly a connection to North Africa. It would
Mhm.
be absolutely pointless to sort of, like, I mean, the Nile River
Mhm.
facilitated trade and cultural exchange. I mean, there are more pyramids in Sudan, if I'm not mistaken. There are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt.
Mhm.
Um, so that's very interesting to me that
Mhm.
Sudan is being taught in this way. Is it? Do you feel that there is a risk if that artificial line is being drawn, and we say, okay, Sudan's part of like sub-Saharan Africa, and Egypt is part of North
Mhm.
Africa.
Mhm.
Ne'er the twain shall meet. Is there a risk that if someone is taught in this way, that they're just not going to be capable of understanding and contextualizing significant political and cultural shifts?
Well, not only is there a risk, it it happens every day. I mean, I think we hear it in the kind of we hear it and we see it in the way that policy is proposed and made about the whole continent, probably, but certainly about the region that I'm interested in, East Northeast Africa, as it's sometimes called, the Horn of Africa, as it's sometimes called, um, because because not just Sudan and Egypt, but as you point to the Nile, right? I mean that and I'm putting it in quotes, right? That originates somewhere in what we now call Ethiopia. But what that means is that all those places along that river, but so rivers become geography. I mean, my students and I were
Mm,
just talking last week about what if we talked about spaces not just as land masses, right? So continents, but oceans, right? And so you actually have oceanic histories, right? You have an Indian Ocean history and a
mm,
Mediterranean history, right? That totally reorient the way we think about how we should situate and think. It's just one choice to sort of center history around the geography of continents, and
mm,
then of course we sort of undo that by breaking up continents in this case. But I think my point is to say, absolutely, it does distort it, and we see the implications of it. There are extremely, many centuries old histories of contact between the people along that river, and that includes, of course, the people in its tributaries in Uganda as well. But certainly the peoples of what we now call northern Ethiopia, the Abyssinian highlands, up through all of Sudan and the sort of verdant space there around what's now Khartoum, and up into Egypt. Of course, these people were
mm.
connected. They were trading. They were sharing ideas. They were sharing written language. And then, as Islam, of course, moved the other way, Islam, also comes in many spaces, right? Muhammad's early converts have to escape down to what we now call Eritrea and Ethiopia the other way. But of course, Islam is also coming down from the north. So, I mean, again, I mean, I'm a political scientist, not a historian, but when you learn the history when you're learning the politics of Northeast Africa, you must learn the history, and that history completely explodes any division between
Mm.
North and the rest of Africa, because they're in constant contact. Far before Europeans even discover that there's a continent that they want anything from.
And it's to go even further than that. I can't remember exactly where I read the comment, and I'm probably butchering it, but the idea of that, the history of a country is basically the study of its borders, and the study of a
Mm,
country's borders is
mm,
basically just the study of its geography.
mm.
And
Yeah.
the two are inextricably linked. That
Hmm.
you can't avoid it. And so
Yep.
the neat lines that the British drew with rulers, I
Hmm.
mean, geography doesn't care about those.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
but
exactly right.
so but so let's sort of start looking at this, because 2021, obviously Myanmar has her coup,
Hmm.
and that was, there was a big deal. It's not the first coup that's happened in Myanmar, fine, but it was the first significant coup in quite a while. But simultaneously, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe in that year there were 5 coups in that northern third
Or
of Africa, in like a coup
they call it
belt.
the Sahelian belt. That's right. Coup
Hmm,
belt. I don't like calling it coup belt because it's just there's so many ways that these things, they're sort
hmm,
of uniquely African, which is why I love the parallel to saying let's go outside the continent and look around the world, right? Because these things are
yep,
not happening in a vacuum. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. Along that belt of the Sahel, which is just below the Saharan desert, is the region that we call the Sahel. So you have
hmm.
Burkina Faso, Guinea. Gosh, now I'm going to forget all of them. Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, Chad, and Sudan.
Okay. So I mean, there's quite a lot going on there, and these are so Chad is a country that, I mean, I
Hmm.
suppose it'd be good if we look at all of these, but I think Chad is a country that I think a lot of people are familiar with as having internal strife for
Hmm.
quite some time, being
Hmm.
relatively unstable. Sudan, obviously,
Hmm.
enormous, very infamous civil war in the split into North and South Sudan.
Hmm.
Let's look a little bit westward. Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali. Burkina Faso and Guinea are relatively, if I remember correctly, relatively small countries, and they don't get a lot of international attention. I think the only thing I can remember is Burkina Faso is, I believe, inland in West Africa. There's no post.
Sure. I mean, part of why we don't, right, is these are francophone countries. So if you were in
Mm,
Paris, you you wouldn't know much about Sudan, perhaps. I'm making a
okay.
really blanket statement here. So that's not really true, but you would know a lot about Mali, and probably a lot about Guinea, and a lot about Burkina Faso, and definitely Chad.
So
But
that legacy of
Americans and the
colonialism
Commonwealth,
lives on.
exactly. That's exactly right. Here we see the legacies of colonialism. Absolutely. So these are sort of spheres of influence that persist 75 years after the colonial project, and this is part of why these coups happen, right? Is
Mm,
that citizens are so unhappy with what they perceive as the corruption and mismanagement of their own governments, but they
mm,
see it as linked directly to what their governments are doing with the former colonial power, in this case, France. And so all of those cases, except Chad is a minor difference, but in the other cases, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, the the um, the um, the military coups, and immediately France is told your troops must leave immediately. Your
yes.
advisors, but especially your military troops. Chad, yeah, the military troops have to leave, but Macron comes almost right away, and it's a dynastic kind of coup, right? Because it's Debie's son that takes power. So it's
Mm,
not the same kind of coup as the others. But the bottom line is that in Gabon too. I mean, all these places you have. There, it's not a coup, but you still have a change of regime. The French don't totally leave, but there's a tremendous dissatisfaction with the involvement of the French in what are seen as corrupt and ineffective leadership.
Now,
Um,
th- and the thing is, people can complain. People
mhm,
complain about stupid things all the time. But
mhm,
what seems to be, I don't know, the French seem to have a very strange relationship to their former colonial
mhm,
possessions, like very, very strange relationship. I was recently watching something about I believe it was Haiti.
mm,
The the fact that Haiti is in an inordinate amount of debt because in exchange for being recognized by France,
mm.
the liberated slaves had to pay compensation back to their
That
former
is correct.
masters.
Yes.
And what I was horrified to discover was that the first president of Haiti, who actually said, "We will not honor that debt because it is, on the face of it, obviously abhorrent," um, very quickly found himself on a French military jet
Mm,
and then in exile in the Central African Republic.
yeah.
So the French seem to really have fingers in pies, and the
Yeah.
currency unions that they have
Yes.
with the West African CFA franc and the Central African
That's
CFA franc, they seem to be very willing to pull a couple of economic triggers
right. Mhm,
and really control what governments do, especially when those governments bring into question the exploitation of raw mineral resources.
mhm.
Um, so it would seem that in these cases it's very fair that the people of these countries want the French military presence and the French economic influence pushed out of their countries. But would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think you've
Okay.
summarized it well. I mean, I think it's also, the ongoing conflict, post
Mhm.
Arab Spring and the fall of
Yeah.
Gaddafi. I mean, there's a lot of also political insecurity things, and then the presence of the French. But the French military has also been there. But absolutely, it goes all the way back to the way that France organized colonialism, um, and tried to regionalize and tried to get all the French, not all, but many of the French West African colonies to form a union. They, of course, rejected that and had independent states. But the common currency, the CFA franc, became part of that. It was tagged to the French franc, right? So they've never sort of been able to, um, you know, de-link their
Mm,
development from always a lower status, and from each other, right? And sort of have autonomy, and then you add that to the security issues, for decades, and
mm,
then you layer on top of that patronage systems, right? That the French patronage towards post-colonial leaders has created this, very very accurate perception among citizens that when their own leaders and elites are skimming off the top, sometimes quite significantly,
mm,
it is, with the direct assistance of the French government, and so over time citizens become angry, and they believe that the military would do a better job, and the military takes a strong, line on the French, and that's popular. And that is certainly what we've seen in the last few years. But the only thing I would add to that, if you don't mind, is,
Mhm.
I think two things. Historians have been doing some really great work lately, and I can barely keep up with it, frankly, which is great, on sort of, and theorists too. Like, there's a lot happening in the edges of what we would call sort of African theorizing, right? Which or Africanist theorizing, although a lot of it's been done by Africans, as you would expect, which is to sort of think through, like, what are these different models of colonialism and what do they mean in 2025, right? I mean, there certainly are some differences in the way that the French and the British and the Portuguese and the Americans in their sort of neo-colonial models had an impact, both historically and through the post-colonial period. And there are differences that are interesting and noteworthy and relevant. But at the end of the day, like, they've all got these sort of hands in the pie. Was that your expression? That are partly born out of necessity, right? Because of the structural inequalities of racial capitalism and global capitalism that we find ourselves in, and the structural inequalities of colonialism. Um, but that end up being quite similar in their effect.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think it's important to note those differences because they do lead to sort of different responses, right? So we see this thing called the Sahelian coup belt, partly because there's a pattern of responses amongst former French colonies that seems similar, and that makes sense, right? And there are
Mhm.
other ways to respond, maybe, but I mean, that's where Sudan is interesting. The Sudan has had 35 coups since
Wow.
independence. Not all of them have failed. Some have, many have, I mean, sorry, not all of them have succeeded. Many of them have failed or been aborted. Several have succeeded, quite, you know, spectacularly.
Yeah.
But that's a former British colony, right? So it's interesting to see anyway.
Yes. And so continuing on this, because this is something that um, I I see as a very different point than the Myanmar, because in Myanmar, of course, the military staged the coup, and it is generally going to be the case that a coup will be staged by the military of a
Hmm.
country.
Hmm.
But in this case, it sounds like in the francophone countries, the military have, even if not the consent, you're making it seem as though they maybe have the broad support of the
Hmm.
people. Is that accurate?
I mean, in these recent ones, I mean, that not, I would not characterize, because some of these countries have had earlier periods of coups, right after. I mean, Guinea certainly had a history of coups earlier, and
Mm.
then sort of went through this period of multi-party democratization, as other countries did in the 90s and 2000s. Mali certainly had a sort of,
Yeah.
in quotes, remarkable, whatever that means. So I mean, democratization in the 90s and 2000s, that was seen as a model, and then but in the recent waves of coups, with the exception of Sudan and maybe Chad, again, I think, and I'm putting big asterisks here because these are not the countries that I'm really an expert on, but I certainly, again, I have to teach African politics, so I try to keep up, and I have, have lots of colleagues who are experts in these countries, so I try to follow them. And my sense of the reading is that particularly in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and maybe Guinea, certainly Gabon, popular opinion of the leaders in power was so low because of a combination of insecurity in large parts of the country, owing to a lack of kind of a national military. So local civilians are not in favor of the local insurgent groups, right? Which, if I understand what's happening in Myanmar, is quite the opposite, right? These are
Yes.
not local groups that have popular support. They are local groups that are predatory and violent, and the national military is also seen as predatory and violent. But a strong man, literally, and a
Mm.
kind of cadre of military around them rise from within the military, take over, and say, we're going to put down these local insurgencies. We're going to bring back centralized security. I mean, whether they do or not remains to be seen. But that's the loose, the promise. And we're
Mm.
also going to rein in state corruption. We're also going to kick the French out because they're part of this corrupt system, and bring back to the citizens order and development through a highly centralized system,
See,
but through the military.
the thing is that actually is very similar in a lot of ways to the pre-coup reality of Myanmar,
Mm.
because
Mhm.
the mythos of the military was that the military was the institution that had liberated Myanmar from colonization,
Mhm.
which okay, but
Yeah.
that's a bit of a leap, but okay, we'll take that.
Mhm.
But then the military basically went through this long period of saying, well, we're working towards democracy, but the country is not ready yet. You just have to trust us. You have to follow us. And they keep moving that goalpost back by telling the 2/3 of the country that are majority, ethnic Bama, hey,
Mhm.
all these ethnics in the border regions, they've got all these armies, they're doing these terrorist bombings, they're growing drugs, they're doing all this sort of stuff. So we have to continually fight them. And for a very large percentage of the population within the central ethnic Bama region,
Mhm.
that propaganda worked because they thought, oh wow, like I see all this footage from the military telling me that these ethnics have machine guns and rocket launchers and
Mhm.
all this other sort of stuff. Clearly we need the military to keep us safe. And the coup was very much, I think, an eye-opening experience for a lot of the ethnic majority who did buy into the propaganda and didn't realize just how insidious the military was, and just how flippantly they lie. But the narrative that you're telling me uh, from the context of Western Africa seems to be exactly the same narrative that the military used in Myanmar. The one question that I would then have is, in Myanmar, of course, the military says, well, we are needed to keep you safe from corrupt politicians. And
Mhm.
that was their complaint. They lost the election in 1990,
Mhm.
and immediately after losing the election, they nullified the election, and
Mhm.
they effectively changed the constitution to let us not even speak of this question of election because people cannot be trusted to vote for their leadership. And
Mhm.
then when they lost the election in 2020, they were basically saying, well, we are needed to restore democracy because we have concerns. But the military are themselves the beneficiaries of a corrupt economic system that they've established
Mhm.
through privatization of something in the vicinity of about a fifth or a quarter of the industries in the country.
Mhm.
Is that part similar in the West African context, to your knowledge at least? Are the military genuinely divorced from the corruption that they're trying to
No,
fight?
no, of
Or
course. Yeah.
okay, so they're still spinning the same
I mean,
story.
again, first of all, some of these are very recent. Some of these people have arisen within the military and were somewhat unknown. I think, like in Mali. So yeah, I mean, it's time will tell. These are maybe just a couple years old, but I don't think the consensus out there is that they are. What they are doing in some cases is actually resolving some of these. Local groups that really are. I'm sort of losing my thread here, but in some cases, like in Mali and Burkina Faso, my understanding is that they're able to effectively restore security to people who are being attacked by people who are outsiders. They are not. I mean, I think that's the one distinction, right, that's becoming clear in this conversation. But whether or not they, don't have their hands in the kitty. And one of the interesting developments, and likely your listeners and you have perhaps heard of this, or at least are familiar with this phenomenon, is that some of the early rallies, saw the Russian flag being waved. We've seen Russia. More than China even, but certainly China's there, and some Middle Eastern countries. We'll get back to the Middle East when we talk about Northeast Africa more, but certainly Russia has come in the breach. So it's not like I mean, they need some foreign actors, right? They're being sanctioned
Mm,
by the U.S. And France is out, except in Chad, and I think they're still in Gabon. Again, not a coup, but a difficult transition. In the other
mm,
places that had coups, France is basically gone and so they're not there as a source of quote development, but also military assistance.
mm.
So who's there? Russia, right? And that's not being evenly distributed, right? No one actually thinks that. And I'm not just saying that because it's Russia. I'm just saying that because the military is
Yeah.
also right going to control whatever mineral resources there are, whatever
Mm,
and in some places, we haven't talked about Niger, right? Um, Sorry, I haven't even brought that up. So, I mean, again, like the nitty gritty of each of these places will certainly vary, and I would love for you to go to West Africanist on. because I think it would be tremendously interesting to go down. But my
Mm,
sense early on is that it's not simply a replacement, because Russia's historic and contemporary engagement with West Africa is not the same as French involvement.
mm,
But that, no, this is not a democratization via a military, right? Except that the insecurity demands of the citizens were very real and different, and that the military's ability to address that may be, at least in the short term, more possible. But I don't think the sort of patronage and corruption issues anyone is particularly optimistic about. But
yes, and as you say, it's not a democratization. So,
Mhm, mhm,
do you foresee the militaries voluntarily saying, "Well,
right,
let's have a gradual transition," or
right.
is it, "Well, no one can be trusted with this, so just let us do it"?
I mean, so far that's what it is, right?
Yeah,
It's we'll hold elections, but TBD, to be determined. There's
yeah,
no plan for it, right? I mean, even in Sudan, in the current war, started because there was a plan for moving back to a civilian-led government, and that plan fell apart. But Sudan was
mm,
one of the only countries that that after the 2021 coup had even a plan for a return to a civilian government, as far as I'm aware. And again, there may be whispers of it in places, but there's no meaningful plan. But I think it's a reflection of the very real precarity of citizens in some of these places, that there's also not a huge demand for that plan. And I'm not saying that citizens don't want democracy, because I actually think that they do. I think that they understand what it means to have a say in their government in West and
mm,
Central, this Sahelian belt, for example, and certainly in Northeast Africa where I work, they do. But they'd want a democracy that delivers basic security and food, right? Right, food and
yeah,
security, right? My children can walk to school and be safe, and there's a school that they walk to, right, before they then think about things like an election.
yeah.
And So it's not that they're not, but there haven't been significant calls for it, and I'm not aware of major plans for a return to civilian government of any kind in this belt.
Naturally. And I think the Russia angle is also something that's very interesting.
Hmm.
The Russians, they have a relatively strong relationship with the Myanmar junta as well,
Mm.
although their hands are currently tied in Ukraine,
Okay.
so
Right.
they're a little bit busy. Um, but we know that the Myanmar military has a strong dependence on Russia for
Mm.
military materiel. They actually have to send helicopters back to Russia for repairs. They can't repair a lot of them in Myanmar.
Mm.
And after the coup, Min Aung Hlaing actually was invited to Moscow, and he was given some distinction that probably didn't actually exist before they decided to make a medal for him and give it to him. Um, I think it was at the military officers academy. So the relationship is there, but the Africa one interests me because I also saw the Russian flags,
Mm-hmm.
and I do wonder what's going on there, because what we heard about with regards to Russian involvement in Africa, what we've heard a lot about is Wagner.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, Wagner is very simple and straightforward. They want control of resource sites, and
Yeah.
they do not particularly care how they get the control of them.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of confused as to why a lot of Africans would be waving Russian flags. I mean, sure, like maybe you might look at them as, well, they're better than the French, who've been,
Yeah.
hurting us and exploiting us for hundreds of years. But it's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face, isn't it? Like the Russians are not a better alternative, are they?
They're not. But I think at the citizen level, when you see that in a rally, that is exactly the kinds of and again, I'm not trying to be insulting to Malians or Burkinabe or whatever. Um, but at the very local level, when you see a flag like that in a crowd, that is the direct result of social media and disinformation, intentional disinformation, right? That is not people who understand that the Wagner group is even something necessarily distinct. That is what it's been doing in, say, the Central African Republic, distinct from what the Russian government has been doing, right?
Okay.
It is there's direct disinformation being spread in social media. West Africans are extremely connected technologically for the most part, particularly in cities and even medium-sized towns, right? But even rural farmers these days in most parts of Africa will have some kind of internet access. They may not be literate enough to be on social media, but in towns they are. So those people you see waving flags are being exposed to direct disinformation campaigns that summarize Russian involvement as not French. Full stop.
Yes.
Right. So for them, it's not seen as what you're saying, although certainly some analysts might say that it is. Again, it's just really important to recognize. I mean, I think we've seen this a lot in other issues on the continent, that there's a couple things happening right now in the sort of global shift. Right now, as in the last couple of weeks and months in the United States' role, but also just globally in the last couple of years, which is that these countries with long histories of colonial and neo-colonial relationships, and in that I put America into the basket with France and the UK, because between its relationship with say Liberia, but also right almost immediately after colonialism, right, our relationship with say Zaire, the DRC, and early involvement, right, we're in that bucket in many ways. There's both a yearning for new and different partnerships and choices, aka China, but then also both China and Russia, during the Cold War and throughout, were seen as providing opportunities for an older generation. There is a historic legacy in some countries of a relationship with either or both China and Russia of an earlier age. Certainly not the one of today in either of those countries is not what I'm arguing. But there's, again, if you're a leader and you're trying to communicate a message to citizens to get their support of you seeking out these partnerships for different reasons, you can call on some kind of historic legacy, right? That's sort of vaguely remembered. Of when the Soviet Union, brought students to Moscow, or when China, did this, or what China's doing now. So that's, a big part of what's happening, I would argue.
But I think it's a logically fair and reasonable argument to make. I don't know. It's always strange for me when we look at something, when we watch something, the discrepancy between how people can act. You can look at someone when we're looking at a country as a country. We're not looking at it at the details. We're just looking at it as a homogeneous, uniform blob. It's so strange because we don't consider that the people in the cities and the people in rural areas have fundamentally different experiences. They have different things that affect their lives. And so it's very easy to skew public perception, international public perception, when the people in the cities are the ones who are saying certain things, chanting certain things, writing certain things on their signs, and they're the ones who get photographed, they're the ones who get broadcast, and they're the ones who probably have better access to internet because that's where you're going to put your internet infrastructure, and that skews the reality. And then the people who are living out in the rural areas, who are actually dealing with legitimate conflict, don't understand what the people in the cities are complaining about, because they might be complaining about something that isn't even real, and they're completely ignoring the things that are legitimately hurting the rural communities, but they're not in a position to really express themselves. So that, and just, I don't know, the way that colonial legacies play into the way that people perceive their own position in their own countries, whether or not those are currently pragmatically factual things to believe, the legacy, the way that people were ingrained to think about themselves lives on, and it's very perverse to watch.
It is. I mean, it reminds me of what you were saying about Myanmar. I mean, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to think more about this broadly comparatively, and I always do, because I find, either at the country level of, say, Ethiopia or Sudan or Djibouti, it's not valuable to think too long at the country level, to broaden my own vision. But even at the continental level, right? Like, to really get comparative is so helpful. And what you were saying earlier about sort of how in the pre-coup period, if I understood you correctly, right, there's this ability of the regime to sort of represent, parts of the the north, the rural region. I forget sort of how those regions are called
Mm,
as acting in particular ways, right? And it's a
mm,
misrepresentation, right? It's a mischaracterization, and that, I mean, I think that's the really pernicious part of this, right? Whether it's misrepresenting things that reflect colonial legacies or misrepresenting things that are very much the responsibility of the current leader, right? And both are happening. You sometimes hear critics say, "Well, don't blame colonialism. How long is colonialism going to get blamed for?" First of all, a really long time, right? Because these are extremely pervasive systems. And back to the border
yes.
thing, right? Like these are complete fictions that evolve out of processes of extreme violence and um, so it's going to take a while for these not to have an impact. Like certainly not in my
Mhm,
lifetime will we not be talking about them, but also many of them are contemporary, and yet this is the divide and conquer impact of it is tremendous, and it doesn't take a lot to have a tremendous ripple down effect, right? Because states have so much power
mm,
over information and perception, and they can use that power for quote good or not, and rarely do they for the former.
yes.
In terms of people's perceptions of each other within whatever the entity is, right? That may be within a city or maybe within a country.
Mm. And it is, even when they don't do that. That was the other thing that was so strange for me when I was walking around Yangon.
Mhm,
There's a place in Yangon that I really enjoyed when I was visiting there, because there is a pagoda
mm,
called Sule Pagoda. And Sule Pagoda is historically the sort of central pagoda of the city of Yangon.
mm,
Shwedagon Pagoda is quite national. It is, for Buddhists in the country, it's probably the most important pagoda. But Sule is more tied to the city of Yangon, and it was in walking distance from where I lived, and it's actually a roundabout. It is a large roundabout. People just drive around Sule Pagoda, so you got to sort of dodge traffic to get into it. But what was really cool to me was that on one corner of Sule Pagoda, across the road from it, is Saint Emmanuel Baptist Church, and directly opposite to that, across the pagoda, across the road again, you had a mosque.
mhm,
And I could stand on the street corner of Town Hall, and I could see a Christian place of worship, a Buddhist place of worship, and a
mm,
Muslim place of worship in a single frame.
mm,
And people were going about their worship, and they were doing their thing,
mhm,
completely respectful of one another. And that image that was you know always present, especially where I lived downtown in Yangon. Like, it was,
mm,
people were very close to each other, right? The Indian Muslim community lived very close to the Burmese community, lived very close to the Chinese community, and so on.
mhm.
It gave a certain image. And then, while I was there, a genocide was being planned, and
Yes.
the beginnings of the genocide were being carried out. And then later on, still while I was in the country, a full scale genocide was being carried out against the Muslim minority population. And it's not even about the government propagandizing and saying, "Oh no, our country doesn't have racist problems." I propagandized myself by
Mhm,
failing to recognize that the balances between religious and ethnic groups within a relatively educated and privileged urban center do not magically translate nationwide. And and that was the same thing when I had, gay friends in Yangon, being
mhm,
gay, relatively safe, relatively fine. There were drag drag
mhm,
shows every month, at one of the local sort of French restaurants.
mhm,
I think Tuesday nights at Seven Joint were gay night. Everybody knew that was gay night at the local pub. Um, Nobody
mhm,
cared. The police never raided it. But when I had gay friends who came from out of the cities, you don't ask them what their relationship to their family is, because
mhm.
that's just not the done thing.
Yeah.
um and that was the difficulty of realizing, oh my god, my privileged experience in an urban setting
Mm,
does not translate to the remainder of this country.
mm,
um and it's
mhm,
just, I don't know, it is
mhm,
it is insidious.
mhm.
I don't,
Yeah.
but no matter.
And that, I mean, I don't know in Myanmar, certainly on the, on the African continent, that not to bring up colonialism again, but I mean,
Yeah.
that is a direct legacy of colonialism, because the way infrastructures were built, it's not that colonialism didn't build any infrastructure, colonial powers, sorry. I mean, it's not an abstract. They were people
Yeah.
and they planned it. And they planned infrastructures, but they planned infrastructures around resource extraction and colonial borders, right?
Yes.
So they didn't build them across borders, and they didn't build them to facilitate the movement of people within a particular nation that they were building. They built them to extract resources down particular rivers, from particular mines, from particular coffee or cocoa fields or cotton or cattle. And what that means is that there's this extreme, I mean, of course, in the United States, in the UK, there are rural areas and there are city areas, and there's some differences, but they have evolved in a much different way than these hyper constructed, very modern, relatively speaking, um, infrastructures of trains and roads and ports that were built almost entirely to facilitate resource extraction, and a little bit the movement of the colonial, people, the missionaries and the traders and so on. And so they don't facilitate the movement of the people that now occupy these territories. And in some cases, they intentionally block them. And so these people, I hear the story that you're telling about Yangon and about Myanmar generally, and it echoes so much to me, both personally as a foreigner traveling and living in multiple countries in East and Southern Africa, but just more generally for the way that the continent is constructed and the way that citizens in different countries have described to me their experience of getting to know people, whether they're of different ethnic or religious groups, but also just different parts of the country. That applies even to places like Tanzania, where their first post-independence president, Nyerere, really, worked to build things like everyone speaks Swahili as a national language, which was really revolutionary in Africa. And he, was successful in ways that others weren't. But there's still so many other barriers to Tanzanians sort of thinking about themselves as one nation in other
Yeah.
kinds of ways. So,
And it just got me thinking, like when you were talking about the infrastructure projects, and it's so true, because the French were doing their thing in the West, fine, but the British controlled South Africa, the British controlled Egypt, and they thought, well, wouldn't it be lovely if we could have a railroad north south across the continent?
mhm,
Okay, logical, fine, but the thing that just amazes me, if you look at a map of Africa today, and you look at Namibia, and
mhm,
there's this weird panhandle that juts out,
mhm,
and it was because the Germans thought, well, we own Namibia, we own Tanganyika, modern day Tanzania, so why don't we build a competing railroad system
mhm, mhm.
or boat system east to west across the continent? And
Exactly. Right.
the British encouraged them
Mhm,
and sold them a plot of land, and just
mhm.
neglected to mention that that plot of land ends in a phenomenally precipitous waterfall
Yeah.
that the Germans were never going to be able to build anything across.
Yeah.
And but it's still there. The modern day border
Mhm,
of Namibia
mhm,
basically reflects a practical joke that one colonial power played on another colonial power
mhm,
in their respective infrastructure projects. And it's just mind-boggling to me,
mhm,
the idea that you could go out and talk to someone, and they might identify as, oh, like, my identity is this, and the reason their identity is this is because a couple of British officers had a really good laugh at the expense of
mhm,
German colonial aspirations.
mhm. Yeah.
I don't know. It's so strange to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So many. There's likely a lot of fascinating stories for the ridiculous borders. I likely don't know all of them, and I probably don't want to, because they would probably infuriate me.
yeah,
But yeah, there's a few little panhandles across the continent that definitely don't make sense and lead to a lot of conflict. I mean, right?
of
The
course.
Casamance in Senegal, is another one below the Gambia, right? The Gambia sort of juts into Senegal, and the southern part has long struggled to feel, and to actually be integrated. And the border
Mm,
between South Sudan and Sudan is,
yeah,
led to massive war and heartbreak, and is another, product of the British imagination.
Well, so let's turn to Sudan then, because that's notionally what we're discussing today, and we
I
haven't
mean,
we haven't
it's all
really done yet.
interesting, so thank you. Yeah.
It's all yeah, it's all amazing stuff. But so Sudan, previously Africa's largest country by
Mhm.
landmass. Um, I'm not going to embarrass myself by pretending that I understand anything of its history. So I'm just going to invite you to give me and give the audience a respectful overview of Sudanese pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial history.
Well, I am going to respectfully say that that will be very difficult for me to do in the time I have. So I'll try to say a few uh, interesting things that might pique the listeners' interest in wanting to read more or just look for more. There's some wonderful stuff. There's a Sudanese British journalist who's actually, I just looked it up, the president of SOAS. I did not realize that. Zainab
Wow.
Badawi, Badawi, has a whole film series on African history, and she also has some productions on the war in Sudan. She's just brilliant and lovely. So I do encourage people who want to learn more about Sudan to look up Zainab Badawi's work. I actually did not realize she's currently the president of SOAS. So that's an interesting connection to our earlier conversation. So I'll give a quick overview so that we can spend more time on whatever we would like to. As we already said before, Sudan is was previously the largest landmass in post colonial Africa. It's the heart of many. I mean, of course, every part of Africa can claim to be the heart of African civilization, and rightly so. There's much we don't know about sort of prehistory in Africa, partly because many of these societies did not have written language, or the beautiful architecture and cultures that they built, didn't sort of were built maybe intentionally or for whatever reason unintentionally not to survive. So there are some beautiful archaeological digs being done in South and Western Africa, for example, that have uncovered beautiful things. We, of course, know some of them, Timbuktu in Mali, and Great Zimbabwe in Zimbabwe, some of the beautiful architectural remains. But certainly Northeast Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia have some ancient remains that, and also written languages that give us the opportunity to sort of see the richness of prehistory in Africa, pyramids, ancient rock churches, a beautiful church and Muslim religious documents as well that have survived. So that prehistory is there, and I encourage folks to go look for it. The earliest centuries we see Arab nomads settling in what Sudan. It's even the Sudan that remains after the independence of South Sudan is a country that has a very diverse topography, right? So you have a very fertile crescent where the Nile basin sort of comes together around Khartoum and Durham and a city I always sort of butcher, as you can hear, Omdurman, two cities that come together as the Nile branches. And that's a fertile crescent. That's where the British later settled. But nomads had brought their cattle to pasture there, camels and cattle and smaller animals that were domesticated because of the water, and farmers had farmed there. But first it was nomadic pastoralists that settled there, and later agriculturalists. Egyptians, of course, followed. Early Egyptian settlements came later, and then the British settled. First, they jointly ruled in that area, both Egypt and Sudan together, and then eventually Sudan was sort of separately a British colony briefly, and then it gained independence from this, what was called an Anglo-Egyptian condominium. It's just a sort of technical political language for this joint rule of Sudan and Egypt under the British. Gained independence in 1956. And it was a huge country to rule. So I've already suggested that there's this fertile area around the Nile, but to both the east and west, there are more arid lands, particularly to the west, the area that's become more familiar to us as Darfur. But I mean, that's a huge landscape. That's an area, that's the size of many European countries. I don't know how many, but a large part of continental Europe would fit in just Darfur, just Western Sudan. And then to the east, up to the Red Sea, the port of Sudan. There's water access there, crucial water access, right, up to the Suez Canal and down out into the Indian Ocean, bordering what's now Eritrea, down to bordering Ethiopia, along that side. So crucial border access, water access, sorry, touching large parts of Egypt, and then down at the independence, including what's now South Sudan. Egypt had, the really important thing here is that, the British, not Egypt, the British had basically divided the country already, although that history is often not taught, and seen in the pseudo-racial science of that was popular in the US and Europe at the late 19th and throughout the first half of the 20th century, as Arabs as, sort of superior to, quote, Africans, all Black Africans lumped together, and all Arabs lumped together. And in that racial hierarchy, they constructed Muslim Sudanese to be considered Arab, and other individuals in some other groups within Sudan to be, quote, African. Now, how the British did that was a messy, imperfect, and deeply racist process of classifying groups, right? So being Arabic speaking, being Muslim, being phenotypically lighter, being wealthier. These are some of the ways that one might become, and I'm putting that in quotes, become Arab to the British administration. And then other groups that maybe did not speak Arabic, maybe were not Muslim, although in some cases, groups that were Muslim also were not considered Arab. So I'm just being careful here to say that there was a lot of fudging of these categories. But in any event, the British system was the British colonial project was very interested in classifying Sudanese into Arab and African broad categories. And all of South Sudan was what was then part of Sudan, became South Sudan, was classified as African, seen as poorer, despite having, like the rest of Sudan, parts of it which were quite and are quite lush agricultural areas, and some parts that were arid areas, some parts with settled agriculturalists, some parts with nomadic groups that move with their cattle. Most of southern Sudan was not Muslim. That's an important distinction. And they were not Christian at that time. They were mostly practicing traditional religions. And the British intensively sent in Christian missionaries, Anglicans, Protestants of various denominations, lots of Catholic denominations, to assist them in their colonial project. And they did not even allow them to proselytize, for the most part, amongst Muslim groups. So you would have a Catholic or a Protestant mission with a headquarters in Khartoum, the capital, but most, if not all, of their missionaries were in South Sudan. They were not in Darfur. They were not in the north. And also, they significantly underdeveloped the South. So road construction, education systems, higher education, universities, and these things were really centralized around Khartoum and northeastern Sudan, Port Sudan, larger cities. And the Darfur was neglected, certainly, as was what became South Sudan, those provinces to the south. As you would expect, you have significant grievances, significant inequality between racial groups, between religious groups, among ethnic groups. I'm massively summarizing here, just for the interest of time, so we can get to the discussion. But I just want to put an asterisk here and say I'm really summarizing, because there are a lot of ethnic groups within what was Sudan at independence and what becomes Sudan and South Sudan. But it leads to two significant civil wars after independence between Sudan and what becomes South Sudan, 1955 and 1972, and 1983 and 2005. At least 2.5 million people die, most of them in the south, most of them civilians, largely due to starvation and drought. The Second Sudanese Civil War is considered one of the deadliest wars since World War II, and it left the South really devastated. It led to something called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, and eventually a referendum on the final status of South Sudan, with 98% of South Sudanese voting for independence, which they received. Later that year, And unfortunately, South Sudan erupted into a civil war in 2013, 2 years after independence, which has also proven to be quite deadly. We can talk more about that. I can talk more about Sudan. I want to stop for a minute and let you tell me where you want me to go.
Well, so just first, I want to cotton on to something that you said, uh, because the coverage. I was in university when South Sudan became independent of Sudan.
Mm.
So I was at least sort of politically aware, even if I didn't have much of an understanding of the situation. And I remember, I get the emails from Amnesty International, so I was aware of the genocide. I was aware of Darfur.
Hmm.
I knew that these things were happening, but I recall that in a lot of the coverage in media, and I know that this is something that has been decried to the ends of the earth, very, very fairly and legitimately, but a lot of coverage likes to focus on simple sectarian
Hmm.
definitions, and a lot of the coverage would say, well, the northern population is predominantly, you know, Arab Muslim, and the southern population is predominantly, African and Christian.
Hmm.
Is it the case that that categorization is something that was effectively invented by the British colonialists? It's not an accurate reflection of who those people fundamentally are or were. It is an arbitrary distinction that has been introduced by the British that we are continuing to perpetuate.
That is a fascinating and important question for all of us to ask. And by that, I mean, are all of our identities invented? Of course they
Yes.
are, right? I mean, and so I'm sorry that I'm taking like this huge view, but I always start with that. I think,
Mm,
right? I mean, there's no line between white and black. There's no line between Irish and British, um, in the sense of like, I inhabit it, right? I inhabit my body and I decide which parts of I mean, I'm given a mother tongue. I didn't choose it. I'm even sort of maybe given a religious identity. Mother tongue is the thing, my first language, or
mm,
languages, if I'm given multiple ones by whatever family or culture I'm growing up with. But almost everything other, and I have a phenotypical, set of characteristics, right?
mm,
A perceived color. But even that is a collective project, right? Like that's the whole concept of passing. And these things happen in Africa too, right? Like people can acquire different linguistic habits if they have the privilege to, right? If they can go to university or if they can move to a new city. And, so there are ways of passing as well. So all that is to say, like, certainly colonialism interjects in some parts of Africa in particular, and Sudan was certainly a place, Rwanda's another place, South Africa, is sort of the extreme example in Africa of this, where the colonial project, and other settler colonies, Algeria, the French are really involved in this. So I'm not trying to say that it's only Sudan, it's and that it doesn't happen in Africa, because it does, and it does happen in Sudan. That the British are deeply invested in entrenching a set of difference. Um,
mm,
the difference is already there in a sense that there are Arabs who already have acquired wealth through cattle, right? And they are already a bit wealthier in local denominations than settled agriculturalists, interestingly, right? Because they have movement, they can go on Hajj to Mecca, they go to the West. So they're picking up goods, they're picking up enslaved people. The trans-Saharan slave trade, for some time was quite lucrative. So they're picking up salt, they're picking up, so this is a centuries long movement of people, and nomads are actually privileged in that. And they're mostly Arab. They tend to intermix in both marriage and production of children, so they end up getting a little bit lighter, right, phenotypically. Um, but this is well before European race science interjects any sense
mm.
of racial hierarchy into that. So
And by the way, in what way
you
are
get
they
what I'm
Arab?
saying,
We keep
right?
calling them Arabs,
Right. Well,
and
I mean, yeah,
that's a broad term.
right.
So what, like, I do wonder about this. Like, when we talk about Arabs
Yep.
in Northern Africa,
Yep.
are we suggesting that there was a migration of populations from the Arab Peninsula and they spread across North Africa?
Both
Or
they were going in both ways. Sorry, I'm
okay,
losing my voice. There are people going in both ways who end up becoming the people. I mean, again, I am not a historian of 15th century Africa, so I feel a bit humbled to be trying to take what I've read of other scholars' work. I mean,
Mhm.
I study contemporary politics, but I need to know these things to be able to try
Yes.
to, to try to understand a coup that's happening in Sudan or a civil war in Ethiopia, because these things get projected as about ethnicity or about race in these places, and they're complicated. My
Mm.
understanding, I encourage our listeners to go look for some of the rich literature that's been written on this, much of it in Sudan, because Sudan has been an epicenter for this idea of like, what is an Arab, right? I mean, if you're in Jordan or if you're in Saudi Arabia, and even if you're in Algeria, well, let me less Algeria, even if you're in Morocco, let me say, or Egypt,
Mm.
very few people are problematizing what is an Arab. Maybe they should, right? Because a
Mm.
lot of them have links to other parts of Africa, right? People who have migrated to Egypt over centuries and become part of what is Egypt. If you go to we have a campus in Qatar, actually, Georgetown does, right? If you go there, there are people who say that they're Qatari or Omani, and they look phenotypically, they would be phenotypically racially identified as Black in the United States. Why
Mm.
is that? Because people have been going from, this is back to geography. Is it Africa or is it the Indian Ocean? They have been moving. The Sultan of Oman had his capital in Zanzibar, which is now part of Tanzania. So, I mean, people have been moving, and they may now identify as Arab. And what does that mean to them? You may ask two Arabs, what does it mean to be Arab? And they may give you two different answers. Just like if you ask two white people in America on February 3rd, 2025, what does it mean to be white? I can assure you they may have two different answers. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm. Okay. So, but then
Sorry, that's
to
like super
clarify though,
theorizing, but I mean, in Sudan, it's the epicenter. And what I mean by that
yeah.
is there's a very, very contentious question in Sudan. It was never a place since at least the colonial project in the early to mid 19th century. It, or maybe by the late 19th century, I should say. Sudan was a place, unlike Egypt or Saudi Arabia, that you could not say, I never think about what it means to be an Arab, because it was always like when Sudanese go on Hajj, they often say that they are identified as African, and they themselves, Arab Sudanese from Khartoum, think of themselves as Arab.
Okay.
They identify as
That was the
Arab,
question
but they
then.
look African to other Arabs. But for
Mm.
them, being Arab in Sudan was constructed by this sort of British project. I guess that's your question, right? Sorry, I'm getting further like the longue durée kind of. The British project constructed them as Arab because they spoke Arabic, because they were Muslim, because they were wealthier for the most part. And colonialism helped to make them wealthier, but they were perceived to be wealthier, and they were generally, they were the nomads. And so
Mm.
like the sort of British project around the Belgian project around Tutsis in Rwanda, there was a group that they perceived to be, sort of more dominant, and then they helped to make them more dominant, right?
Yes.
Does that make sense? Sorry, I kind
Yes,
of
it
veered off.
does. And
Yeah.
I'm just, for me, look, I actually used to teach a course on history, politics, and identity.
Ah,
Although I'm woefully unqualified to do it, obviously. But
yeah.
this is a question. So, would it be fair to say that a very large number of the Arabs in Sudan may identify as Arabs? They may be Muslim, they may speak Arabic, but simultaneously, it may also be the case that none of their ancestors ever set foot on the Arab Peninsula.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of
Oh,
course.
really?
Yeah.
So we can say that the Arab identity was imported to a population.
But I don't like that word imported, because people move. I mean, this is back to the
Ah, okay.
migration debate of today, right? People have always been moving. So
Mm.
the thing about Northeast Africa, I mean, really all of the northern, like the trans-Saharan trade and this trans-Sahelian trade is like a movement that goes back at least to the 13th and 14th century across West Africa into the Arabian Peninsula, into the Mediterranean, into Europe, right?
Mm.
I mean, so like only a few people are going both directions, but it's bringing ideas and goods and
Yeah.
people intermixing and intermarrying and
Mm.
whatevering. And the ideas are coming, right? Certainly
Mm.
Islam, but also the language, right? So I guess all I mean to reject import, or just to push up against imported,
Yeah.
is that it's a language that suggests like someone comes from outside and says, and now I'll give you, something called Arab, which might be the language, it might be the religion. It was, my understanding of it is that it was really a back and forth. And so you find these African influences I mean, my history professor at UCLA was studying the role of Swahili in southwestern India, and he was interviewing people who could speak Swahili, who looked phenotypically Indian, mildly darker maybe, but maybe it was the sun. Like they were in really, tropical parts of India. They could speak Swahili songs that their grandparents had taught them, but they didn't even know it was Swahili they were singing, right? That wasn't imported. That was a product of the Indian Ocean trade. Monsoons that were going, people ended up on that coast, never went back when the Dhow went back to Zanzibar, right? Married a man who married an Indian woman and sang those songs to his child and his grandchild. They don't even know that they're speaking Swahili anymore. I mean, they know they're not speaking, whatever language that their community speaks. Sorry that I can't even remember what it was, because it was like 20 years ago that I heard this lecture. This is Ned Alpers for those who want to read about it. But I mean, it's remarkable. People were moving in this Arabian and Indian Ocean space, and we've barely touched the surface of looking at that history. Partly because there's resistance in the South Asian and Arab, Arabian Peninsula to a fulsome historicizing, and in Sudan and Egypt to that. Sorry if I get off on my tangent.
No, but I mean, look, honestly, because you keep coming back to the Indian Ocean, and it's something that in my own sort of research projects keeps coming up. Like when I learned that Madagascar is Austronesian, like the people of Madagascar came from the basically the Malay Peninsula. They didn't come from continental Africa, despite what, looking at a map you might think is more logical. And yeah, like even when I studying currencies as I do, and I found out that East Africa used to use the rupee, the Indian rupee, as a currency, because the British just decided, well, trade happens across the Indian Ocean, so we may as well just unify the currency across the Indian Ocean. Continents be damned, like that's not where the money moves. So I think you raise very legitimate points. The reason that I was sort of trying to circle in on this is because in common perception, when we look at a situation like Sudan, especially if we're white and Western, it conjures up an image of, and I know this may seem very odd, but it conjures up an image of Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia was, we can sort of quasi call it a colonial construct. Czechoslovakia was created in the wake of World War One, and it sort of fell apart in World War Two, and it was restored by the Soviet Union, who basically ran it as a vassal state. And then in, I think it was 1993, the Czech Republic and Slovakia separated in the Velvet Divorce. And so there's this idea that when colonial powers establish a country, we know that that country doesn't represent really the natural, pragmatic divisions of people in a region. And so when there is a separation of these colonially constructed states, I think there's this habit where we think, oh, okay, well, nature has been restored. The people have drawn the lines themselves, and now everything is fine, and we've returned to the pre-colonial status quo. But it's the reason I was going back to this is because from what you were saying, it made me realize that that's not necessarily the case. We may be returning to a new representation of a colonial way of thinking and a colonial way of dividing and defining peoples.
That's exactly. I mean, I would argue that. I think, back to a space that I feel much more comfortable in. Although I'm so curious to read history, I feel woefully inadequate at just talking about it. But to the contemporary period, this is a very important, thing for us to think about as people who work on African politics, is this question of this sort of borders, as you say, and it comes up as it should all over the world, for goodness sakes, I mean, but certainly on the continent and other post-colonial spaces. And I would argue there is no natural state, right? I mean, borders are constantly being negotiated everywhere around the world, and especially in places that have been most recently colonized. And that certainly is the case for really all of the continent, right? Geographically. And in that case, there's no natural state to return to, right? There were certainly some kingdoms and some semi-centralized, ruling spaces that we can identify easily, and some, less easily, but somewhat. but they no longer exist. People are evolving. We live in evolving social spaces, right? Um, and so those people were interacting with colonial powers, right? They weren't static, immovable human beings within the colonial entity that sort of like froze and waited for colonialism to wash over them. Um, and similarly, in the post-colonial period, right? Like wonderful and awful things have happened in political, economic, and social life since the end of colonialism, whether it's, just a few decades ago in South Africa, or whether it's 75 years ago in the case of places like Sudan. And what that means is that any changes to borders, whether they're internal, state creation, Ethiopia has been dividing and reconstructing states inside the state. I think Sudan as well, really needs to think about these things if it could ever get to a civilian government again to do that. That's fine, but like that is a reflection of the fact that we have to
Yeah.
recognize that people are creative and evolving, and so yeah.
Mm. I mean, again, it is, as you're talking, I'm thinking of the creation of the Myanmar identity as
Mm,
well, which
mm,
again was, you can't, I can't even completely blame the British for it. I mean, I will anyway, but
mm,
um, it's strange because the British themselves still recognize that, well, the Shan Hills is their own
mm,
thing.
mhm,
We're not going to pretend that they're part of Burma. I think the Kachin had a degree of independence. The Arakan Principality, was conquered separately to the rest of Myanmar. So the British even recognized some degree of independence within the colonial construct, and it was really this strong push post independence to say no, 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 no. Like there will be no talk of restoring independence for these regions and these peoples.
mm,
We will create a Myanmar identity. Um, so it's very strange. And so let's sort of look at that this period here. I believe, and correct me if I've mistaken the timeline. I believe when these terrible purges and genocides were happening in Sudan, this was under Omar al-Bashir, correct?
that's correct. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
ones, I mean, if we move past the civil wars in South Sudan, which resulted in a horrific loss of life, if we're talking about the purges in Darfur, that some parts of the world categorized as a genocide, and for which al-Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court. Again, I mean, these are contentious sort of categories, but if you're referring to Darfur, yeah, that was
Yeah.
2004. Mhm.
And just coming back to your earlier point, because I looked it up in the meantime, Darfur is very nearly the size of Spain.
Yeah. Okay. I was trying to think of the comparison. Thank you. Mhm.
Yeah, it is very close to the size of Spain. It is significantly larger than I had imagined.
Mhm. Thank you.
Um, so yeah, Peterson projection. Anyway, but yeah, so looking at this time period, what was going on internally?
Mhm.
Because you're saying that the British have come and they've formalized distinction between the Arabs and the Africans. What was sort of happening in in Sudan? What was the government trying to do? Were they trying to create a single unified identity in Sudan,
Mhm.
or were they trying to continue and foment the distinction between A and B? Like, what was their thinking?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the key to understanding Darfur is right back to where I sort of ended when I was giving my long soliloquy that I apologize for about sort of the colonial and South Sudan civil wars, because post independence broadly, again, a broad brush, the Sudanese regime was had several failed coups and a couple of successful coups, and the most significant was the coup in 1969 of Numeri, and he ruled quite ruthlessly for about 16 years. There were multiple other coups, and then al-Bashir comes to office in 1989. So between he's the one who prosecutes the second Sudanese civil war, and it leads to terrible loss of life, and it doesn't succeed, essentially, right? I mean, it leads to this loss of life. So many people are dying in the 90s, and then we get to this point of the comprehensive peace agreement. And part of what happens is that arguably the regime, the Bashir regime, which is an authoritarian, military-led government, um, both loses the civil war in the South after causing so much loss of life, or allowing this war to go on, and so on, but also failing to see, sort of out of the left side of its eyes, so to speak, as a regime, that that's also there's marginalization and grievance also in the West. That's fomenting. It's happening, right? These groups in the West have similar grievances, even though they are ethnically and racially categorized as Arab, not African, and even though they're also Muslim. But they have also been marginalized, both by the colonial powers and by the post-colonial regime. And they also have a lot of interethnic tension, which is also similar to South Sudan, right? Because I already said they got independence in 2011. The civil war breaks out in 2013. There are a number, we could go on about South Sudan. They're a beautiful place, and there is a peace process in place, which we hope will work. But there are a number of ethnic groups in South Sudan, and they didn't even really work together quite well during the civil war. But after the civil war ends, which is the only thing that sort of unites them, there's considerable, disunity amongst the groups about how to rule. Darfur also has a number of groups that I'll come to in a second. They're also, disagreeing with each other, but also have grievances against Khartoum. And really Bashir's regime sort of fails to recognize that during the early 2000s, as the comprehensive peace agreement and what's called the Juba process is proceeding towards the independence of South Sudan. And so the timeline is important here, right? Because it's just as we're getting towards the signing, and that signing took years in the making, the 2005 peace agreement. As the CPA, as it's called, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, is getting signed or about to be signed, is when the Darfur, uprisings break out. And they break out against Khartoum, but they also break out against each other. It's basically complete insecurity in the West. And it's supported by Deby, the father, who's now passed away in Chad, right? So again, colonialism, like you said before, like it's not all the colonialism to blame, but they can't be let fuck here. You have a border on Darfur and Chad that divides ethnic groups. So you have several major ethnic groups that have large parts of their clans on the Chad side and large parts on the Darfur Sudan side. And what that leads to, right, is groups that are located in and a very porous border, right? A border with a couple of border crossings, but don't nomadic groups and other groups that pass quite easily for centuries, like unaffected basically by colonialism or post-colonialism. And why would a regime come in and disturb that anyway? They would have started a protest, right? So it's not like Bashir has ignored putting up or any regime in Sudan, putting up a better border per se. Maybe they did, but also like that would have caused violent opposition if he had. So you've got this porous border. You've got Deby in Chad, who's co-ethnics on the Sudan side, ask him for help in fighting other ethnic groups in Darfur. And those ethnic groups in Darfur are complicated. Sorry to make this so. They're also divided into agriculturalists versus, although they're all technically considered, almost all of them are technically considered Arab in this sort of Arab African, kind of Sudan constellation. Some are pastoralists. Those tend to be, better armed, and they attack the villages. So when you saw, or the listeners saw, pictures of villages that were being burned and women running from villages, those tend to be the settled agriculturalist ethnic groups. They're almost all Muslim. Again, broad strokes here, so there are some exceptions, and that's important. But they're almost all Muslim, and they're mostly all classified as Arab, but they're settled agriculturalists, and the ones that are attacking were generally pastoralists. These are also competitions because of shrinking natural resources. So human-induced climate change is playing a role, but also the state's mismanagement of those resources, right? So humans have another role because the state has really neglected Darfur, the Bashir regime. The very important factor that comes in, so the biggest factor is that the peace agreement is coming forward, and these groups in the West, in Darfur, say, well, if they're getting a peace agreement and autonomy, we want some. They don't necessarily want to secede, some do, but mostly they want more autonomy. They want to control their regions more. And they say, well, if the South is getting this, we should too. So they foment various rebellions. They fight against each other. it's more complicated than that, but I'm summarizing. And then the very last thing is that Bashir can't fight all these wars at once, right? He doesn't have enough. He's leading a military coup. How does he get enough fighters? So he arms what the West termed, and there was a time that there was this Janjaweed, right? This horseman. I mean, it's a very sort of racist and evocative picture that gets drawn, and so I'm hesitant to use it, but it certainly was a very violent paramilitary group that Bashir funded and sent off on their merry way, and they were paramilitary, but they had the support and the blessing of Bashir because he didn't have enough military to go and fight this battle in the West, and they were headed by a very brutal paramilitary general, or whatever his term would be at that time. I actually forget what his exact title was, known as Hamiti. His proper name, now I'm looking for it, his family name is Dagalo, but he's mostly known in Sudan as Hamiti. Very brutal. He is not from Darfur. He's from an Arab group in another part of Sudan. And he leads this group and becomes, he's already known, but he becomes sort of infamous for leading the Janjaweed, who are riding horses, to burn these villages down. They don't have to stay long. Then the groups are fighting against each other. There's attempts at peace agreements. A UN peacekeeping force is put in place in Darfur. That's really not very successful in much, but there's a peace that's restored by, sometime in 2005. Bashir is indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity for empowering Hamiti and this, Janjaweed group, but nothing really comes of it. In fact, he's really able to quite successfully internally use that piece, that ICC indictment, much like a more recent leader in the Middle East has been able to use an ICC indictment to rally folks around the nationalist flag in Sudan and to say, we're being attacked by the West that wants to, sort of recolonize us. We're just trying to keep our country together. We've already lost South Sudan and we've lost so much land. We've got to keep ourselves together. My colleague,
and to interject, Myanmar did the same.
Interesting.
With the ICJ indictment, which, people were not really talking about the genocide.
Yep.
But when the ICJ case, or not an indictment, it was a case brought by, I believe it was brought by the Gambia. When that case came out, you saw billboards through Yangon, and some people got upset because the English language on the billboard said, "We support our leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who went to defend the country nationally." The Burmese on the billboard was an imperative. It was support the leader.
Yes.
So it actually galvanized, and a lot of intelligent people that I knew, a lot of educated people, were really upset and really offended that Myanmar was being attacked internationally over whatever it was going on. It was a special military operation and nobody needs to ask questions about it. Yep. So again, exact same thing happening in Myanmar as well, domestically trying to use international backlash to galvanize support for the status quo.
Yeah. I vaguely remember reading that. I'm so glad you made that parallel. For me, that's really, really helpful.
And I just want to quickly ask the Janjaweed, what was their motivation? What were they getting out of it? Was it ethnic hatred, or were they getting paid, or what was the deal?
Getting paid. Hamiti's, the closest forces that he brought into the region were getting paid a lot. Hamiti is extremely rich, and his closest cronies are. So now, of course, Hamiti is, heading the Rapid Support Forces, which is one of the two main forces that's fighting in the current civil war. But he's a very wealthy man.
So this was not settling scores. This was not, let's find a tribe who already hates the people that I hate and just give them carte blanche to do what they want. This was, let's find people who don't have any particular reason to hate anyone and pay them enough to hate someone.
It's both. It's not really hatred. Again, there are people who've studied this closer, so the level of hatred, I couldn't put it on a 1 to 10 scale. These are certainly, when we would see those images, those kind of very classically westernized, decontextualized images of villages burning and women running from them and facing sexual violence, which of course was very real. There were at least two broad categories, quite different categories of sources of that violence. One is interethnic violence, right? Groups within Darfur who have long-standing grievances against each other, who are pastoralists and settled agriculturalists, right? Who are fighting for competing resources that the government is not helping them manage, that are both human-induced climate change and human-induced marginalization by the state, right? And so those are interethnic. I mean, they're multiple ethnic groups in the Darfur region, and so a group might attack another, and there we might say, like, okay, that's interethnic hatred, but it's also interethnic competition that the state is not managing. The other that leads to the ICC indictment and that leads to Hamiti and the so-called, quote, Janjaweed, those are outsiders. They're not from Darfur, and they may not like people in Darfur. They don't hate them necessarily. They may not even know them. They might certainly don't speak the local languages, right? Like, so they're like, those people are poorer than us, they're less than us, right? I mean, the elites in other regions of the country, right? It's back to this point we were saying earlier, are so that people don't travel around the country and know each other, right? So,
Yeah.
and they're also just men who are being paid to be mercenaries, right? They're sort of internal. So I don't know the level of ethnic hatred or whatever to the extent that it's your job and you're a mercenary.
But it's like, it's your job, but it how should I put this? When you're a mercenary, if we look at classic mercenaries, like, say, executive outcomes, to take the preeminent African example,
Yep.
executive outcomes is known for a lot of things, but an orchestrated campaign of sexual violence is not among them.
Yeah.
And when we talk about like, hey, I've paid a bunch of people, that's not what you would expect to result in the sort of things that we saw coming out of Darfur, like things that were so bad that they had to be censored. In amongst stories of rampant sexual violence, there are still layers that no Western media would be willing to publish, because they said it's just too vile and reprehensible for any of our audience's sensibilities.
Yeah, but I mean,
You know,
I'm not an expert on, what the executive outcome, right? We're talking about like Sierra Leone here, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's where
yeah.
they work. So, I mean, gosh, I haven't read up on that in a long time. I remember teaching it very early on in my teaching career. But I mean, here's what I would say about that, right? There was rampant sexual violence in Sierra
Oh,
Leone.
absolutely.
And even if executive outcomes hasn't been known to be the ones orchestrating that sexual violence, they were there when it was happening, right? They knew it was happening. Um, I mean, it's just impossible to be part of these systems of war and not be cognizant of the violent use of child soldiers, the level of sexual
Mm,
violence that was happening in a war like the Sierra Leone War, because it's quite similar to the Darfur War, right? I mean, even if the images look different, right? Because it's the landscape is different and
yeah.
the cultural tactics of war are different, the social cultural tactics. They're both, you know, mer- wars of desperate people, right? Of people that the state has abandoned, right? I'm sorry, like, to me, that, and so the mercenaries, whether they're executive outcomes, and we sort of picture them as one kind of mercenary group versus the Janjaweed, to me they're quite analogous. And I don't know how much the actual Janjaweed elites participated in that sexual violence or just oversaw it. Like, I haven't read a good report that parses that out for me. And if you find one, that would be interesting. But I'm quite sure that executive outcomes was at least aware of, if did not observe, if not did not participate on an individual level in the kinds of rampant sexual violence and use of child soldiers and violence against children and women in Sierra Leone, which is only to say that, um, you know, there are different levels of participation. But at the end of the day, when you're participating in any of these kinds of I mean, whatever, I'm a pacifist, so you're not really going to
Mm,
find me justifying, like,
yeah.
legitimate acts of war versus illegitimate ones. But of course, I recognize that we're talking about, extreme kinds of violence against civilians and women and children that really, are hard to sort of even
Mm,
grapple with, as you say. But I find, like, the mercenary distinction a complicated one for me, sort of morally and ethically, to grapple with, if only because I don't see the distinction between them and sort of local armies pillaging, if you will.
mm.
I don't know.
And look, and I think that's a very fair point to make. And for you and for anyone, like, if you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend um, Shadow Company was a documentary made by Al Jazeera, and they actually interviewed some of the executive outcomes people. Just it was just a fascinating insight into the world of mercenaries and what they are, but the good and the bad. But the reason I'm asking is because when we look at Myanmar, as distasteful as the topic is, I think, you know, we have a habit of not wanting to discuss things like rampant sexual violence because they're so distasteful. But
Mhm. Mhm.
in avoiding the topic,
Mhm.
we are not attacking the topic.
Yes.
If you follow me, yeah.
I do.
And so I think in Myanmar, like the military engage in orchestrated campaigns of sexual violence.
Mm.
That's just a thing that they do, particularly what are
Mhm.
called the light infantry divisions.
Mm.
They're a little bit separated from the rest of the military, and they are just the killers. That's their job, right?
Mm.
They don't do transportation, they don't do
Mm.
medic, they don't do they do killing. That is their job.
Mm.
I think there are 12 divisions, and particularly the 22nd, 33rd, 77th, and 99th are notorious for their rampant crimes. But also, when we look at Rakhine State, what we saw was that a lot of the actual violence being carried out, a lot of the burnings, which are even this, like last year, villages were being burned down in
Mm.
an orchestrated scale, is being carried out by, to simplify it, one ethnic group against another ethnic group
Mm.
that is endemic to that region. The military may oversee it, they may aid in it, allow it to happen, but a lot of the actual violence being committed is being committed by the militias of one of the local ethnic groups. And
Mm.
that's what I was trying to get to in the Darfur case
Mhm.
in Sudan. Like what are the dynamics there? Is it we're sending in a force and they do terrible things, or we send in a force and they just sort of empower others who have a latent desire to exploit the chaos to just run wild or settle old rivalries or whatever the
Mm.
case may be?
You know, I, I, I think in the very beginning, my understanding is that in the very beginning, the Janjaweed was a small but very active participant. That's my understanding, including
Okay.
up to and including Hamiti. Um, but that there was already enough interethnic, um, there was already this interethnic tension and fighting,
Yeah.
partly brought on by the comprehensive peace agreement that was being negotiated for the South. So Darfuri groups were sort of jostling for um, for what they perceived might be an opening for the
Yeah.
region, but particularly for individual groups within the region, right? I mean, that's sort of the divide and conquer strategy playing out. So it didn't take long for that to become um, the interethnic part, right? And that's why
Yeah.
when the Janjaweed withdrew and the international community came in and set up UNAMID, this peacekeeping force, and tried to negotiate amongst the various, formal rebel groups. There were 3, 4, 5 formal rebel groups, GEM and a couple. I can't even remember the names of the other ones. Some of them are still around,
Mm.
even, and some in reformulated ways. But when they tried to negotiate, a peace agreement, it just really has not ever gone anywhere.
Yeah.
Because, well, one, because the groups are all asymmetrical in size and in need, um, and then also because, particularly after 2019 when Bashir left power, um, there was not a state to, then there's just become even more a multiplicity of interests right across Sudan.
Mm. And so you brought the peace process, so partially because I'm conscious of your time and partially because I would like us to talk about something a little bit more uplifting. Um, the
Lovely.
the peace process uh, in South Sudan, you said that there is, I don't know what the word was that you used. I'm just going to insert optimism
Yeah.
um, towards this peace process. And obviously, what we want from Myanmar is a transition to peace as well. And I'm wondering whether there are lessons that can be learned here. What can you tell us about the peace process, and what is it that can make a region that has seen so many layers of conflict, not just a central government abusing its people, but so many internal layers of conflict come to say, all right, let's lay down our weapons and let's transition to a stable system? How do you achieve something like that?
Yeah. I mean, that's the $1 million question. And
Right.
it animates. I mean, I'm not like a conflict researcher, but it certainly animates the other kinds of work that I do. Um, I mean, I don't think actually South Sudan is where the optimism can come from, because it's
Wow.
really fragile in South Sudan. Um, I mean, the civil war has at least ended, and there's a peace deal, but I think the actors are really disingenuous. They keep stalling elections, and the patronage system is really kind of undermining it all. So I'd rather actually look at Ethiopia for a quick second, if you're okay with that,
Please.
as we wrap up. And it's ironic that I would say that, because if we started with Ethiopia, I would be so not optimistic. But if we zoom out to the region, it's actually the most optimistic of all of them. Even though generally, as an Ethiopianist and a person who's probably done the most work in that country of any on the continent, and certainly it's my area of expertise. It's hard to be optimistic about Ethiopia, but I remain optimistic about it, and I think it's a country that's seen multiple civil wars, in the last 50 years or so. Well, I mean, a war of overthrowing the feudal monarchy in 1974. Then they had a socialist dictatorship, and they had multiple civil wars on multiple fronts throughout the 1980s and into 1990. They had a period of peace. And then they had a border war with Eritrea from 98 to 2000 that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And then, of course, the recent war, civil war called the Tigray War, which is definitely a civil war, although they don't like to call it that, from 2000 to 2022. And since that war ended in 2022, just tons of violence episodically or sort of regionally, although not rising to the level of a civil war. But I remain optimistic about Ethiopia. One, because I love the place. I love all these places, but my heart is sort of left in Ethiopia. It's much like all of these countries, extremely diverse, 85 ethnic groups, tons of geographic diversity, right? Some people live in the extreme lowlands, some in the highlands. So people often don't have a lot of contact with each other historically. So it's complicated for them to think of themselves as a nation, right? Because they don't, what is it to be Ethiopian? They're like extremely proud Ethiopians, extremely, right? Like the heart of Africa, the oldest written language, Amharic, there's, ancient churches and ancient mosques. Muhammad's, converts fled, death to here, and the Christian king welcomed them, right? Interreligious harmony, all these bases for nationhood, and so many bases for division. But I think, to your point, it's the basis for optimism has to be in the process, which sounds so dorky and academic-y, but it has to be, right? Like, we have to do this day by day with each other, right? And I think it's the social movements work, right? It's I mean, that's what we call it in political science, which is kind of where we were earlier, which is like the states, whether the state is a military coup or a supposedly, the pre-coup, you were describing Myanmar pre-coup, right? And sort of how it was manipulating senses of national identity, or genuinely or not genuinely doing things to sort of integrate marginalized, historically marginalized regions or whatever. Ethiopia has seen all of that, right? It's seen seemingly genuine and obviously disingenuous efforts at unity, obvious, attempts at division that still worked, right? Even when citizens, might have seen that they're being divided. They went for it, right? And so it's the social movements work. It's the movements of, and sometimes those are armed. But even though I'm a pacifist, I'm not going to endorse it, right? But you know, which is only to say, like, back to the borders question, right? Like, I do not think there are inherent spaces on the continent that sort of are these pre-colonial spaces that one would imagine we would go back to. There's no back to, but there may be. We have to be open to the idea that new states could be created on the continent. Certainly Eritrea as an independent state, certainly South Sudan, right? These countries make sense even if they exist as non-democracies now, and they do. Eritrea is an extremely authoritarian state. South Sudan is a very weak authoritarian and corrupt state, but they are in a process of nation building and state building that's much better than them being colonized by the states that they were colonized by, the post-independent states that they were colonized by, Sudan and Ethiopia. in my humble political opinion, and definitely the opinion of the citizens who voted 98 and 99% for independence, right? So we have to be open to the idea that there are places on this continent, Africa, maybe other parts of the world, that either need independence or some meaningful autonomy within
Yeah.
the post-independent state. Um, and the meaningful autonomy is something I believe deeply in. My first book is about federalism in Ethiopia. Um, and I believe deeply in federalism in Ethiopia. Another, text I want to endorse. Thank you so much for sharing the information about Sierra Leone. When I was talking about Darfur, I really want to endorse a book by my colleague who teaches at our campus in Qatar, Rogaya Abu Sharaf, who's written a beautiful book called Darfur Allegories, which looks at different Darfuri identities and different groups of Darfuris post the Darfur genocide. It's just an exquisite book. But I think Ethiopia really suggests that there are different ways that autonomy, semi-autonomy must be imagined and must be created and institutionalized. And it starts with an imagination. It starts with a movement. And I think they're already out there, and we have to keep empowering and imagining them truly, and then actually realizing them, right? Like making
Yes.
them real.
And just on this note, because you're talking about the importance of social movements, which I completely agree with, broadening the scope to other parts of Africa, I know that South Africa
Mhm.
famously established its Truth and Reconciliation committees.
Yeah.
I know that both Liberia and Rwanda have done very similar
Mhm.
committees and panels. So I'm wondering, do you think that those are sort of keys to achieving peace and stability? And is that something that is being seen in Ethiopia, or is Ethiopia an example where you can bypass that and you can find an alternative pathway to peace and stability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. Ethiopia has established one, and it's extremely weak because it's state appointed and the state is seen as illegitimate. So I don't think it's going to work, at least not
Mhm.
right now in Ethiopia, but I wish it would, because I actually think
Yeah.
Ethiopia needs one. Um, South Africa is probably the best of the other three models. Maybe Sierra Leone. I've read less about it. You're making me really want to do my Sierra Leone readings right now. Um, Rwanda is the least. I mean, Rwanda was so limited in scope. I'm talking about the official one now, right? So it was
Mhm.
effective for getting a couple big fish, and it's ineffective for anything else. Um, so they're all a little bit different of the three. A lot of people, including a lot of young South Africans, complain about the South African one, but I think history will tell a very different story of that. I think it will
Mm.
say it was it was really good for what it did. It didn't
Yeah.
create a political party that's not corrupt, but it wasn't meant to. That's not what truth and reconciliation commissions are for. What it
Yeah.
did was get a lot of truth out there. And that was really needed in the South Africa case. So I think tremendously important for getting a lot of white folks and some black and brown folks to get, to acknowledge what they did, and for families to have information about their missing loved
Mm.
ones and things like that. So in cases like that could be tremendously useful. Um, and possibly the Sierra Leone one could be a model. I need to look more at that. I think it might be for certain cases,
Yep.
because I have heard good things about it. In Ethiopia, I would actually look more. Ironically, I feel like we're looping back to the beginning, which might be a good thing. Um, After the kind of not after, at the point of the court of, so, and I'm putting it in air quotes because it's a really weird term, the transition period of the early 1990s, multi-party transitions that of course have mostly led to coups in French West Africa. So in Niger, in Mali, I forget where else, but in a couple of very prominent French cases in the late 80s, but especially the early 90s, they did these things called sovereign national conferences, and they invited huge groups of people in, representatives of different kinds of social movements. They weren't truth and reconciliation commissions, but they were meant to have representatives of all kinds of social groups, women's groups, religious communities, youth groups, labor groups, and they were to help write the Constitution. They rewrote the constitutions in these places. Um, I don't think in a place like Ethiopia, and maybe this is similar to Myanmar or Sudan, um, people want to do truth and reconciliation. They're really
Mm.
angry at each other. But they do want to talk about what this kind of autonomy would look like without like reconciling, if you get what I mean. Like
Mm.
they're
Yeah.
really angry with each other. And they also don't trust anybody to set up a reconciliation panel that is
That's the
the
big
one.
one.
Right. So, but they might be like, okay, you give me this, and I'll like do a little bit of horse trading, and
Yeah.
then build up some trust at the local level that could lead. I mean, that's what I think. Um,
Yeah,
does that make
I would
sense?
agree.
Yeah.
I think Myanmar is kind of in a strange place right now because I would say the majority of the ethnic groups are currently shoulder to shoulder because
Right.
they have a very real common enemy. And
Mm-hmm.
there are whispers and fears that if that common enemy were to not be there,
Mm-hmm.
then the
What
old
would you
issues
do?
would flare up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the last thing that I do want to ask you about, because if I don't, I'll get yelled at, is this applies very much to Sudan and more broadly to Africa, and also very much applies to Myanmar under um, God President Trump. The U.S. is aggressively hacking and slashing aid programs. In Myanmar's case, it was a lot of scholarships
Mm-hmm.
for education that were being cut. I believe that aid to Sudan is being pretty aggressively pared
Mm-hmm.
back at the moment. This is likely to be the U.S. foreign policy for the next 4 years, unless
Mm-hmm.
the State Department has some means to control the president. Do you do you foresee this having a deleterious effect on these regions and fomenting the types of social and economic conditions that led to conflict in the first place? Or do you think that enough progress has been made that the countries that are going to be affected by a sudden cut in US funding are going to be able to say, look, that's fine, we can find external support elsewhere if we need it, and we can find internal solutions to problems as well?
Great question. Yes, I can barely keep up with it, but my understanding is, yeah, almost no aid. I mean, Sudan does receive some of that most sort of extreme humanitarian assistance, so they may be able to access some of that for food aid. But already, not enough food aid is getting into Sudan before these cuts, so it's just going to make that harder. Um, Look, I mean, I think for the war in Sudan, this actually has relatively little effect because Sudan, both sides of the current civil war, are getting their funding for weapons from other actors. And those actors have vested interests in the kinds of resources that Sudan has, mostly gold, but also other resources. The oil pipeline from South Sudan runs through Sudan. Up to Port Sudan has been reopened, the major pipeline. And that goes to China and other Asian, Southeast Asian countries, actually, and then other resources, mostly to UAE, Saudis. So the money that funds the war is going to keep flowing. So the war is going to be unaffected or mostly unaffected by this. Regular folks have been already unaffected by the fact that the Biden administration was already not giving enough aid to Sudan because it was more interested in funding other wars in the world, two most prominently. And neglected Africa in general, and certainly neglected Sudan. So ironically, I don't think this is going to have as much of an effect on Sudan as it should because we already weren't doing enough. Um, in general, I am very concerned for two things. One is the global cut in aid and assistance. Um, I am certainly a person who thinks that African countries should have autonomy, and other countries around the world, Myanmar as well, autonomy in the use of the aid that they get, and be able to use it for programs that are most beneficial to their citizens. But I also believe that US foreign assistance is a powerful way that we are able to interact with countries around the world, most importantly for assistance, development, and humanitarian assistance. But we also know that it gives us a relationship with countries, right? And by completely absconding our relationship through development assistance and humanitarian aid, we leave open the door wide from a strategic sense. And I'm normally not a person who wants to think in those strategic ways, but it's very obvious on the African continent that you are leaving open the door even more to actors that you supposedly, I say you, the Trump administration, not me, because I think my personal belief is that actually more actors on the continent for Africa is better for Africa, right? So China, Russia, and the US and the Arabia, the Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE, let them all be actors on the continent. And that's better, right? Because then African countries have more partners to choose from for different kinds of projects. China, Japan, the European Union, whoever. But if the US, basically checks out, then that's one less partner for different kinds of aid. And that is often aid that goes to these kinds of social movements. Not a lot of it, but more of it that's going to come from Russia, right? So that is my concern, right? Assistance for reproductive health to women, men, and non-binary individuals, LGBTQ rights, HIV, AIDS, civil society groups, journalism, and free press, things that the United States has funded more of than some of these other partners. And so I think that we absolutely should be doing that, and that is both in those countries' interests and our own. So that is the concern that I share with many of the people that I speak with, daily and weekly in Northeast Africa, where I am interested.
So I appreciate the answer, and I know that we're coming to the end of the time that you have available for us. This has been fascinating for me. It's also been and I do apologize to the audience. It does jump around a little bit as an interview, and I think that just highlights truly how much depth of knowledge there is here. I'm sure we could discuss hours a day for weeks on end and still be only scratching the surface of the various political and ethnic and cultural complexities in Africa. But I think it's been fascinating. I think it should be a very eye-opening experience, and I love that you've been asking the audience consistently to engage with the topic and to do research on the topic independently and try to find some more in-depth sources that they can consume. But before we wrap up, as is our tradition here, we always invite our guests just to end the episode by sharing some thoughts directly to the audience. It could be about what we've discussed today. It could be about something a little bit more broad, but any message that you think the audience needs to have in mind, anything that you need or think that they need to consider as they go forward, discussing politics and talking to other people in their lives. If you have any direct message, I'd invite you to share that now.
Well, thank you. I too have enjoyed first and foremost, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to sort of put the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa, in conversation with Myanmar in particular, and just globally, because I rarely get that opportunity. It's so often sort of taken very narrowly, even though it's a big continent, that I feel like I barely can know, but really on its own terms, and that is probably my message, and so the interview itself and the conversation itself has been speaks very much to my message, which is that there's tremendous commonality of our experiences wherever we are, where we're sort of ordinary citizens walking through our day thinking like, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to, make sure that my loved ones have a better life? How am I going to, make sure that the environment is better for the future, for myself and for others? And that's, really at the end of the day, what people in big cities around the world and small little villages in my encounters, particularly in East Africa, are very much concerned with. We also yearn to know more about each other. I'm always struck. Most of my work is in rural Ethiopia and rural Djibouti, and people have so many questions for me about life. And I feel like one of the greatest gifts of my life is that I have the privilege to travel. I have that passport privilege, but I also have a job that helps to pay for my plane tickets to go to beautiful places and ask people questions. So I try to share what I know and share pictures and share other places and other people, even within their own country, right? To sort of say like, this is what I learned from another part of Ethiopia, because they don't get to know that. And I think that to me is also, as much as we think the world is connected, there's tremendous disconnection, even within our countries, and certainly in the West, we're learning, but everywhere. And so just all the things that we can do to, as I said before, to imagine, but also to realize those connections is the work that I imagine that I'm doing, and I hope I'm doing, and I hope we can all do more. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insight Myanmar Podcast. This platform is more than just a series of conversations. It's a reflection of deeply held values that guide everything we do. From raising awareness about Myanmar's challenges to amplifying voices of resilience, From sharing unfiltered truths to fostering empathy and connection, we're dedicated to creating something meaningful and impactful. We strive to bring on guests who can educate listeners about Myanmar's rich culture and complex history, while also providing space for spiritual and mindful practices that nurture resilience. Above all, we aim to build bridges, connecting people across the globe to the stories, struggles, and triumphs of those in or related to Myanmar. If these values resonate with you, we invite you to help sustain this work. By contributing, you're directly supporting a platform that prioritizes human connection, truth, and meaningful action in a time when these are needed most. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanang boda yaranang